Now, sugarcane was first cultivated in Southeast Asia over 8,000 years ago. It eventually made its way into the Indian subcontinent and was then brought into the Mediterranean by Arab merchants in the 9th century AD. Muslim expansion into Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, and then the Iberian Peninsula brought it onto climatically suitable newly conquered territories, where its cultivation was practiced on large estates, worked by Turkic, Balkan, and Mediterranean slaves. Genoese and Venetian merchants described the practice in some detail, so that when the Portuguese opened their first sugar plantation on the island of Madeira in 1432, they simply copied Muslim plantation practices that had been going on for 600 years already. Once they and the Spanish began colonizing the New World, they found conditions perfect for growing sugarcane here too, so demand for a local cheap labour force increased significantly. By 1516, the Portuguese had established a number of trading ports along the Brazilian coast, and like their Spanish counterparts further north in the Caribbean, they largely depended on the labour of local indigenous people, who, at first, voluntarily aided the Europeans in exchange for axes, metal tools, and military support against rival clans. These Native Americans all practiced tribal warfare, also enslaving their conquered neighbours. As the Portuguese began establishing permanent settlements on the Brazilian coast, native raiding parties soon included European fortune hunters, called bandeirantes, who now claimed a proportion of the captured enemies for themselves as payment for their assistance, and these captives were then put to work on new Portuguese farms and sugar plantations. The bandeirantes developed a notorious reputation not only for their cruelty but also treachery, for undermining the missionary work of groups like the Jesuits, whose indigenous congregations were often raided by them, despite the protests of parish priests to the crown back home. It should be said, though, that in 1570, the unfortunately fated King Sebastião I of Portugal had actually issued a royal decree that all indigenous people in the Brazilian colonies were free subjects of the crown and were not to be either molested or enslaved, much as Queen Isabella of Spain had proclaimed when Columbus returned from his trip to Hispaniola in 1492. However, in both these cases, despite the magnanimous position of the Crown, the loophole was that if indigenous people attacked a settlement or failed to pay their dues to the governor, all bets were off. Much as was the case in Spanish America, plantation owners, governors, soldiers of fortune, and businessmen regularly fabricated claims of indigenous violence or actively incited it through displacing them by encroaching onto their lands, so it was easy enough to justify approval for their seizure and penal enslavement, such that indigenous slavery actually increased after 1570, despite these generous citizenship laws, with only the occasional intervention from Europe to investigate abuses and punish corrupt local officials. These settlements rapidly transformed into sugar-producing factories, so many more slaves were needed than could easily and cheaply be acquired through raiding the dense forests of the Brazilian hinterland. In response, the Portuguese demand for captives, back over in Congo, now their chief source of manpower, intensified substantially, which fueled Congo's foreign wars of expansion both to the north and the south.